Hello and welcome to the latest event to be broadcast live from the Energy Hub. My name's Lucy Whitford. I'm RES's Managing Director for UK and Ireland. The Energy Transition Hub has been jointly organised by Energy UK and Renewable UK, and we've been hosting from our RES offices in Glasgow, just across the river from COP26. It might be a little bit noisy today because the office is really busy, which is fantastic. We've got the Conservative Environment Network with us this morning, who are hosting a meeting between Australian MPs and the Committee on Climate Change. Just a little bit, for those of you who are less familiar with RES, we were the world's largest independent renewable energy company, working in the industry for 40 years. Developing, constructing and operating renewable projects across the globe. Thinking about today and this session, behind every successful industry is a strong competitive supply chain of businesses providing innovation, products and services to make that sector a global success story. We must ensure we're well positioned to make the most of the huge opportunities on offer for a world-class supply chain developed in the UK and supplying to the UK and across the world. In today's session, we'll look at how the domestic supply chain in the UK grew up around the onshore wind industry and how it's currently growing to support the offshore sector, which is the world's largest offshore wind market at the moment. And today, I'm really delighted to have been joined by industry leaders to discuss the opportunities and challenges for the supply chain. So I'd like to introduce our panellists. Beside me is Dan McGrail, Chief Executive at Renewable UK. We've got Corinne Barry, who's Business Development Manager at RES. Claire Canning, who is Programme Manager for the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership at Catapult. And Dave Eastman, who's a Project Manager for TRIG. Welcome everybody. So I think we'll just move to the questions. We've got lots to discuss today. So thinking maybe starting off from where the supply chain has grown up through the onshore and learning from our experiences. Dave, you've been involved in the industry for 20 years, operating, involved through the life cycle really from development, construction and now on the operating side of the business. How have you felt the industry has developed the local supply chains in the UK over this time?
Yeah, well, it's been an interesting one. It's a shame we didn't really establish an onshore indigenous turbine manufacturing business, but I'm interested to hear from the panels later on where that's gone with offshore. But what we have done is establish quite a strong balance of supply chain. So that's the foundations, tracks, electrical works like that. So now companies like TRIG and through RES as our EPC contractor, we've got established relationships now with the large civil engineering contractors in the key markets in Scotland and Wales where we operate. And they in turn offer local employment opportunities and contractor businesses with local businesses. So that's a really good thing we do. We can come on and talk about some of those sort of activities. It's also not just in construction. I know in operations now, we used to work solely with the turbine manufacturers, the original OEMs in terms of O&M. Now we have a number of independent service providers as well. So for a business like TRIG, that's good. It gives us other options. So things have certainly developed over the years.
And, you know, just thinking about TRIG, you know, how important is that use of local businesses throughout the lifetime of the TRIG operational assets?
Yeah. Well, ESG credentials, so that's the environmental, social governance thing. It's very important to an organisation like TRIG, and it's something our investors regularly ask about. So if we can be committed to the local community and businesses during construction and operations, that's just clearly one of those things that will meet sort of TRIG's sustainability goals. One of our goals is actually to have a positive impact on the communities that we work in. So clearly local content is good, along with the community funds, school visits, the habitat management plans, those sort of things that we do on projects.
Great. And Dan, you know, just taking from what Dave's talked about, is there more the industry can do to maximise the use of local contractors during that full life cycle, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start off by saying the UK, well, the onshore sector in the UK has got a pretty good story to tell in terms of, you know, historical trends, about 60 to 70% of the content of an onshore wind farm is procured locally. And even though I take the point that Dave made about the fact that the OEM supply chain didn't really flourish in the UK, I think there are understandable reasons for that around the fact that really the big companies emerged out of Germany, Denmark and Spain, and then the kind of complex supply chains that sit behind that in terms of castings and forgings and doing that in serial production that really emerged in those countries. So we've kind of got a high barrier to entry to creating that in the UK. But in terms of sort of going further, I think the kind of three things that I would point out. I mean, first of all is sort of increasing the focus on telling the story of the UK supply chain, and we've tried to do that with the Onshore Prospectus that we launched last month, and and in that there's a lot of case studies which sort of tell you about some of the really interesting stuff. And give an example, just a company like Jones Brothers, for example, who are an experienced civil contractor, have been working across various different aspects of the sector, but then develop over time specialisms in working in, working with ecological sensitivity, working in harsh environments, taking care of the forestry, sort of all of these specialisms which develop and then can be further expanded. So that's kind of a really good story. Then, the next thing is the industry can and should think very, very early on in the development process about how to integrate local supply chains and build that up. And I think that's sort of one of the features of the offshore industry as well, where it's now under quite a lot of scrutiny. And that then is the third point, which is actually learning the lessons from the onshore sector. And the offshore sector, because what's interesting in offshore is that there's a very strong active interventionist approach from the government, and that's where we're trying to bring, from Renewable UK's point of view, where we're trying to bring the sector so that we are working more in parallel and in tandem with government, and have a similar kind of relationship as we have under the offshore sector deal, so that we can break down the barriers to entry that I mentioned earlier, but also invest more in innovation to build up areas of specialism in the UK.
And maybe moving then to thinking about offshore and sort of ramping up our domestic supply chain when we in order for us to deliver 40 gigawatts by 2030. Claire, you work for Catapult, and what role do you think the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership can play in that?
Yeah, I think the Offshore Wind Growth Partnership plays a really important role in helping to drive that domestic supply chain growth. The programme itself was established a couple of years now, following the offshore wind sector deal that Dan mentioned, and it's really about helping to achieve those local content commitments and helping to drive up to 60% local content by 2030. And I think in order to do that, we really need to recognise the challenges that current supply chain companies have in terms of sort of barriers to growth or barriers to entry, and understanding how can we help these companies become more competitive, be more successful, and win a sort of bigger slice of the action. And so the programme that we've established, it's as I say, we've been running for a couple of years now, and the way that we kind of deliver support to companies is really through direct business support, so sort of business transformation, providing kind of expert consultancy, helping companies understand what they need to do to grow, become more competitive, give them market intelligence and strategic advice and support, but also grant funding to help them develop new products and services and bring these into the sector. And so those are the sort of two key mechanisms of support that we offer. The programme itself is funded 100% by industry. So we've got £100 million over 10 years directly to fund, supply chain growth initiatives. So, for me, I think it's got a really important role in helping growth of domestic supply chain, and also, helping to win a bigger piece of the UK content, but also looking at export opportunities as well. So helping to understand, what's the current what does the UK do really well that we can sort of package up and export to, you know, emerging markets. So it's been really exciting. We're working with really excellent companies, you know, some already active in the supply chain, some looking to transition from other sectors like oil and gas. So really trying to understand these challenges and help them grow.
And maybe what, you know, can you give the audience maybe an example, you know, a few examples of, or the challenges or the opportunities? You know, what kinds of things are those?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, from all aspects, I think, of the life cycle for offshore wind. I think what we're kind of recognising is the UK has very strong capability in, you know, in engineering expertise, and there's a big O&M market. And so we're working with a lot of companies that are bringing really innovative products and services into operations and maintenance, reducing the cost of how we do things, you know, minimising the need to send technicians offshore. Working with a really interesting company called Cognitive Business that are helping, they're doing very clever machine learning and AI solutions that will help kind of accessibility and improving safety of crew transfers offshore. And you know, we've sort of supported them to develop and refine their software. They've since won a contract with RWE Renewables to implement that over their sort of offshore wind farms, which, you know, really exciting. And yeah, so and we're also working with companies even from the kind of installation, you know, doing pre-assembly. We're working with a company called Cask in Northern Ireland. They're developing their sort of pre-assembly scope and bringing in new equipment to help them enhance capacity, improve efficiencies, and do things quicker and more cost effective. So yeah, a whole host of projects, different companies doing different things. So.
It sounds, you know, very exciting and real innovation coming through in those companies. Yeah. And Corinne, you've worked in the offshore market for a number of years. You're based in the northeast of England. What's your personal experience of sort of the offshore supply chain and how that's evolved?
Yeah, thanks. So in the Humber region, we're actually one of the biggest clusters, the most advanced clusters for offshore wind. And there's a lot of lessons that can be learnt from us as a supply chain and as a cluster. We produced a prospectus last year for the Humber Offshore Wind Cluster Prospectus, which is worth looking at. And the reason being, I think, for the Humber, is it's an organically grown cluster. So it wasn't a plan, but we had the right ingredients like infrastructure, port, etc., and location to sites, which gave us the opportunities. And what I've learned is collaboration. Now, that word's thrown around quite a lot, collaboration, oh, it's a great thing, but it's much harder to put into practice than it rolls off the tongue. So I think what's happened in the Humber region is that they've learnt to collaborate, but in a competitive environment. So what they've created is they've driven the industry and the market forward within the supply chain competitively, but they've built a framework to work together on that. So they've collaborated together. So it's twofold. It's driven the industry forward, but it's also driven the supply chain forward at the same time. But going back to what I was saying, early intervention. So going back to the, if you look at the most recent reports, we're going to need something like 69,848, thousand skilled persons in the sector. And in the Humber region, the intervention from larger businesses and the engagement has been at the educational level, at roots, which is really, really key, because you're not just going to find 70,000 people from somewhere. And there's a big educational process, I think, and that's the key thing that I've noticed in the local community in the Humber, that the engagement has been at root level with the schools and the educational system, and working with them to then help drive the need and want for those in the area. The likes of Ørsted, obviously, who are, everyone knows, the biggest developer, have the biggest O&M facility in the world, in the Humber. They invested over £10 million into that facility. But they, in order to help the supply chain, they also created a number of community funding legacies. And within the Humber region, I think, correct me if this figure's wrong, around 80% is SMEs. and that is key to the supply chain across the UK, not just in the Humber cluster. So being able to support those SMEs, right down from taxi drivers to the local hoteliers, and as Dan alluded to earlier, certain suppliers that have evolved and innovated their services to develop to the offshore sector has really helped. And I think that's also been the point that Grimsby used to be the world's largest and busiest fishing port. And when that industry collapsed, it left a gap for the offshore to regrow and grow from that infrastructure, which has been sort of fundamental, I think, to the Humber success.
And Dan, I think, we hear a lot about the just transition from sort of oil and gas, but I think Corinne's points are really valid, and that, it's across the workforce that we need to look, and that there's opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the sort of the local stories are always really powerful, and I think that, we're in a fortunate position where we're in an industry which is, growing, but also plays a really important role in the future of the world. So it's like there's a reason to be attracted to the sector, and I think, we're in that fortunate position where, whilst we need to find 70,000 people more or less for the offshore market, and in onshore, another 30,000 in total, and that's by 2030. So start to scale that up beyond, and you get to really big numbers. But we're in a good position in terms of that there are skills that exist in the oil and gas sector that we can transition over, and again, that's part of the sector deal, that we create a framework to help that happen. But we're also attracting a lot of young people into the industry as well, and I think, again, the stories there of people coming in, apprentices, young people, a more diverse workforce, I think is important. Let's remember that I think it's something like 83% of the jobs that are in this industry are outside London, and we're here in Scotland, and very much at the centre of the onshore industry. Something like, and I'm going to get this statistic wrong, from our prospectus, it was about 60% of the jobs in onshore are in Scotland. So there's a huge diversity that comes from the sector. But I think transition from oil and gas is something that we have to embrace, and we have to to work on it head on, because the mechanical and the electrical skills that we need in this sector are well established and they're there for us to use. The risk profile and the way of working is different, so we need to prepare people for that. But the fundamental foundation of the skill set is there, and we can make the most of that.
And I was going to ask you about your offshore prospectus, because there are lots of figures about, particularly for the onshore side. I think it's 27,000 jobs by 2030. Yeah. That's enormous, and across the whole of the UK, which is fantastic. And Scotland is a real hub. We're lucky to be sitting here just across the river from COP, but ultimately jobs across. And one of the things that I find I'm quite passionate about on the onshore is it's not just the large centres, but we're providing jobs into the rural communities that host our onshore wind farms as well, and providing that, allowing them to stay in those communities and educate their kids in those communities, and really sustain them. I think that's important.
I think the energy transition, net zero, affects everything, every sector. The discussions that were predominant in over the river last week were a lot about energy, about our industry that we all know and love. But there's also discussions about agriculture, there's discussions about transport, there's about everything, If you think about the changes that need to be made into something like agriculture, then that could affect farming, and it can affect how things are done. So actually having an industry in net zero in rural communities, which have going to have to change and going to be affected in that regard, is a really good story. We can bring community benefit, we bring jobs, and we bring long-term employment into rural communities, as well as into sort of people in high-rise offices in cities like this, where a lot of the skills are concentrated. So it is a really important part of the story, I think.
Yeah, and it must be really important for Trig as well.
Yeah, certainly, and I can give a number of examples where these local jobs have been created. 2 projects do spring to mind. Our Freesdale and Blairy Hill projects, so they're up in Argyll and Bute in Scotland, and through the partner civil engineering project and through our EPC contractor, we held Meet the Buyer events, so local businesses could come and find out about the project and offer their services. So that's companies like Plantire Equipment, local aggregate concrete suppliers, other groundwork stuff, and actually there was connections with the job centre there for the labour force, and also accommodation providers as well. So although we've got the local content, there are some people also coming into the area. But on that Freesdale project, I know through the contact we had with these local businesses, we were able to award around about £6 million of contracts to these people. I think the figure is around about 85 people were employed at the peak of the construction of that project. And the Blairy Hill project that's ongoing at the moment, I'm sure the numbers are very similar. So it really does show that's local investment. And yeah, we want to do well at the outset for the construction, but also, as you mentioned earlier on, we're here for the lifetime of the project. It's 25 years. We want to have that reputation, that good rapport with the community. I say 25 years, there's actually life extensions and repowering to come as well, so we could be around for 50 years. So there's lots in it for the local community. We want to be in good contact with them.
And we're a little bit swapping between onshore and offshore, but as an industry, it's great to cover both here. Claire, what skills and experience do you think, from an offshore perspective, are needed for the future?
So various, a whole range of skills. To be honest, I think fundamentally engineering. I think I was having a conversation yesterday with one of the companies that we're supporting, and they're we're sort of sidetrack, but through what we're doing with the OWGP, obviously it's about investing in supply chain, helping them to grow. Part of that is creating jobs, and so we're starting to see some of the impact now of this programme of companies that we're helping. They are growing and they're looking to expand, and they are looking to invest in the right skills to help their be successful in the sector. And through having some of the conversations, even just at that level with some of these kind of SME level kind of innovative companies, we're starting to see kind of a shortage in data engineering, sort of data, digital, AI, machine learning, that kind of skills that, particularly in the UK, that kind of very niche kind of experience, and we're having some of these companies are looking overseas to get these kind of affordable skills. So I feel that is an area that there's a huge skills gap, and we should be investing in helping in those particular skills. I think another area that's interesting in terms of what's going to be needed in the future is how we can deliver floating wind projects, and what are the challenges involved with floating, and so investing in developing skills, looking at whether it's sort of moorings, and there's a lot of learnings obviously from oil and gas, but I think for focusing on offshore wind and expanding the floating wind portfolio, I think there's going to be some challenges there from a skills perspective.
And Corinne, from your perspective and some of the things that Claire's talked about, do you see girls as interested as boys coming through? I think that's quite fascinating.
It's always a hot topic, I think, of the industry. The diversity or lack of diversity across the sort of sector as such, and the gap between male and female within the sector. I think the government pledge was 33% by 2030, which I think is not ambitious enough. 33%, is not pushing forward the right message. What we've found in the Humber, though, and with some of the roles that I do engaging with schools, and a number of businesses do this, is there's a misconception of what the term engineering means. And I think that's when I say about early intervention, and relate it back to my earlier comment, we need to educate the educational system. And I actually think it stems from government need to change the educational system in the respect of we need to be educating the educational systems to actually what engineering means and what those jobs translate to, because as Claire's just said, there's a big skills gap in data analysis, but that's like an engineering role. And it's really interesting because I found that once you engage, there's actually quite a lot of female students that are really interested in offshore renewables, but actually they're not quite sure how to go about going into it. And there's a lot of preconception that engineering, or that you have to go offshore on the turbines, because obviously, yeah, as Dan alluded to, a lot of the jobs are offshore, but actually there's a lot of onshore jobs like data analysis that requires you to be, you know, in an office-based environment. And I think, you know, just trying to bridge that gap, but getting more involvement from government, you know, to increase those percentages. It's not an easy thing to do. Again, it's part of that collaboration word I keep throwing around, but it's very true. In order as well for this sector to be sustainable, it needs to be repeatable. So, you know, something needs to be done. I don't have the solution, but, you know, constant engagement in education and it is what I've found.
I think personally at a development level,
Yeah.
it's really good.
Yeah.
But there's more definitely from, you know, into construction and operational.
This is a big. I'm glad you mentioned this point about engineering, because I think it's something that's quite close to my heart. I haven't worked for an engineering company for an awful long time. I think in the English language we need to, or let's say in England, we need to reclaim the word engineer from some of its misusage. It's regularly misused. If your dishwasher breaks, what do? You call an engineer. You know, I've just come from running a company in the Basque Country in Spain, where there's a very clear distinction in education at an educational level between technical careers and engineering. And engineering is a different, you know, as you say, it can mean anything. And engineering is vast. It's, you know, data engineering, software engineering, controls, electronic, mechanical, civil. You know, it goes across the space. And technical careers are, you know, have different entry levels, different access, different educational pathways, and I think that is somehow needs to be simplified for people at, you know, early on. And I think the other thing in STEM, and I absolutely agree with you, you know, we're closing down pathways to people, not just women, but to or, you know, girls, but to people in general. Very early on, because of some of the behaviours we have in schools and in life in general, you know, where we sort of we picture engineering as being this kind of being on a motorway bridge at 6 o'clock in the morning, and actually it's much more exciting than that. Yeah. I think, you know. Yeah.
So. Absolutely. So just to sort of jump in there again, as part of what Res do with the UTC in Scunthorpe, we actually work with their curriculum, and we go in and we work with the physics curriculum actually around data, funny enough. So what they teach is aligned with the role of our data analysts. So they're actually teaching the skills and base the curriculum around what the sector needs. Mm-hmm. And the amount of female students, diverse female students from different backgrounds, that then become interested in it because they have a clear understanding of what Dan said, this word engineering, is fantastic to see. Yeah.
I think as well, helping people to understand what, like transferable skills as well, you know, to come into engineering, because my sort of personal experience is that I got into offshore renewables maybe 7-8 years ago, into engineering, and the way that I did that was through like a doctoral training centre that really was focusing on offshore renewables, you know, bringing in the next generation of engineers into offshore renewables. And I didn't even really know about the sector. I was like, what's this? This sounds really interesting. But my background was in marine biology, marine environmental biology, and they were, you know, actively seeking people, you know, with different backgrounds, whether it's maths, chemistry, physics, coming in different backgrounds and training them up in different elements of engineering so that you can go out into the workforce and do a whole load of different things within the sector. And so that really opened my eyes to say, like, okay, you know, talked about this word engineer, you associate it with certain things, and there's so many transferable skills in different sectors that are really applicable in renewables. And I think helping at a young age, because I kind of came into it in my late 20s, but at a young age, really kind of understanding that is key. It's like sort of getting to people kind of younger, and I think Kareem's reflection is really interesting one, you know, sort of government into the school curriculum, that's where it's really important. And I think as well, just one final point, I think it helping, because there's so much, from an offshore wind perspective, there's so much opportunity now all across the UK. You know, we talked about the Humber cluster, we talked about Scotland, and there's sort of different clusters all across the UK with a whole, you know, operational new sites, and really, really exciting, and kind of creating visibility of that to young people. And you know, this is where you could be in 10 years' time. You could be working in this sector, piloting an ROV, or working some kind of really cool robotic system, or you know, it's just your mind. You just don't think these jobs exist, you know, 10 years, but you know,
so
this
it's
is the
about
future.
creating pathways and showing opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that sort of visibility and excitement. And you know, when I started in the sector, you know, when I was at school, that these jobs didn't exist, and that's how quickly, you know, the sector's progressing. And it's, you know, I think it's exciting for young people, but it's getting that message across.
It's certainly encouraging as an owner to hear about these engineering data scientists coming through, because ultimately this results in us having better uptime and availability of our projects. If we've got a better understanding of how they're working, that's what we want. We can move from 97% to 98% availability, just having this better data understanding and the way these engineers are working on projects.
And
So
Dave,
sounds
you've
good.
brilliantly taken me to my next question, because I'm keen to talk about supply chain opportunities during operations. And you know that, you know, I think as owners, the operational assets and getting the best performance out of the operational assets is really important, and the supply chain, I think, plays a big part in that.
Yeah, and certainly it makes sense to have a local content, and if you've got local technicians there, that helps us for the response times, for that sort of thing. And when these operational projects now, they support an asset manager, a site manager, depending on the size of the projects, a couple of technicians, more technicians, but they don't need to be there all the time, so they're looking after 2 or 3 projects. But what we've ended up with is, say in Scotland, a network of all these different teams. So the net result is this quite significant employment of lots of people working on projects. And it works 2 ways as well, actually. In the contracts that provide the servicing for these projects, they've got availability guarantees in these projects, so it actually suits the service provider to be there and local in order to meet their obligations as well. So it works both ways.
Yeah, and Dan, just building on what Dave said, and not just on sort of on the onshore side, but also the offshore side. What do you think is the economic value in real terms around the operation and maintenance of our renewable energy assets now, but actually, you know, as we grow?
There's got a couple of dimensions to this. The first, in the onshore prospectus, we estimate that about 60% of the jobs are in onshore wind are going to be in operations and maintenance. Okay, so that works out at about 27.1 billion of GVA during the life cycle. So it's a significant impact on in the economy, and that's just onshore. So then, you know, extrapolate that forward for offshore, which arguably has an even more intensive maintenance approach because of the fact that the assets are, you know, in the middle of the sea, and you then need vessels, and you need all the sort of the infrastructure that goes with that. So it's a really important part of the economic equation. I think the other element, and I think to a certain extent we haven't explored this yet, and I think this is maybe something that OWGP will find as we go forward, is that because we have a big installed fleet in offshore, and the biggest and arguably the oldest, we're going to accumulate more hours on those machines and on those power plants than other countries, and we're going to get like a fleet learning effect that will happen over time. So we will learn things about what the reality of these power plants before many other countries do, and I always believe that innovation happens when the boundary conditions are the narrowest. In other words, when you find something difficult to manage in the future, that's when the real ideas start to flow. So my belief is that there's enormous opportunity for innovation in O&M. As time passes, we will see more and more of that, and that can be about digital, it can be about machine learning and AI, but it can be about all sorts of different practical aspects of running one of these power stations. And then the last point I'd probably make is that point around floating, and that, you know, as we learn the lessons of built. I went to visit a floating wind farm yesterday, and it was, you know, it's a staggering piece of engineering. And I learned a statistic, which I thought was, or it's not a statistic, it's an analogy, which was brilliant, that a floating foundation for the next generation of offshore wind turbines kind of fits inside a football stadium. You know, just to kind of give you a kind of sense of how big these things are. So maintaining, looking after assets like that, which are then going to be serialized and deployed at scale, is going to be another area for huge opportunity. But the jobs we create in this are meaningful, they're long-lasting, they're in the communities that they're serving. So we should all, you know, be telling that story of the value of long-term service.
Yeah, absolutely, and exportable into the future. As when you say, you know, the learning we're taking because our fleet's older, and you know, we're having to innovate to keep them running, that we can then export to other countries. And Corinne, sort of the skills, technology, knowledge required, we've talked a little bit, and maybe about the types of contracts you see coming through. Can you give us a flavour of those?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, so obviously Claire's touched on some of the skills and technology, but I think actually if you look at the, obviously Dan's used the word innovation, and again it has many connotations. It's not physically down to a structure being developed, it's an idea and it's an approach. And I think if you look at the sector now and how it's developed and advanced in the last 10 years, I mean, if you look at the original strike price at £150 per megawatt and now it's sub 40, that's happened in the lifetime of a student going through education. I mean, it's a phenomenal growth and development in our industry. It's unrivaled, really. And I'd actually think the types of contracts we see now are not what we're going to see in 10 years' time, because the innovation that Dan's talking about, you know, in floating wind, are these substructures still going to be the size of a football pitch? You know, the developments and the progress that happens, and that has happened in the sector, I think we're going to be looking at different types of contracts and different types of O&M that's being carried out through these lessons learned, that you know, through this fleet learning that Dan's mentioned. And also with the development into floating wind, a lot of people are questioning, well, okay, we've done O&M in this manner in fixed bottom, but does that fit with floating, and why do we still do it that way? And the right questions are being asked, rather than putting a box around it and that whole, you know, thinking, looking at it from a completely different aspect. And this is where the word engineering does come into play, and bringing in people from a diverse background and different sectors, like many of the panel have mentioned earlier, and bringing those people in to look at it from a different angle, and obviously then reaching that next percentage of availability, so to the point where, you know, we are hitting 100% availability. You know, the contracts at the moment that we see in the sort of Humber cluster region are anything from a contract from accommodation to an SME, right up to the balance of plant types of delivery, to a fabrication type of contract. So the type of contracts can range from a couple of thousand to a few million. So the opportunity there is ripe for picking, so to speak. And me personally, I'm, you know, really interested to look back at myself 10 years' time in this conversation and see where the sector is around O&M and what our approach is then, because I think it'll be completely different, if I'm honest. Yeah.
And Claire, I suspect you agree.
Yeah,
with
I was
Corinne a
smiling
lot.
when Corinne was saying that. I think it's so exciting, like thinking where the sector's going, and you know, we're sort of shifting towards anything that you can do to reduce costs and improve safety, which kind of means sort of reducing the need to send technicians offshore. Well, if you do that, then you need to do so much remotely using kind of robotics, autonomous systems, really clever, exciting things. And you know, when you translate that into kind of job opportunities and skills that are needed, you know, kind of comes back to what we were talking about. But I think, like, O&M, you know, we've kind of talked a bit about that, and that is a real area of strength for UK supply chain. It's a real big export opportunity, I think, for us. But I think, you know, thinking about innovation, and I think there's opportunities throughout the life cycle of offshore wind, right through from kind of site development, consenting, you know, looking at how we collect environmental survey data, right through to kind of construction, installation. You know, Dan mentioned about the size of foundations. We're thinking about the size of turbines. It's sort of, you can't fathom how big these structures are. How are we going to install them? Like, we don't have vessels to do that. So it's sort of thinking, what's the next generation of kind of heavy lift and installation vessels, and what do we need for construction, and even the kind of cable laying and everything that goes in, you know, through to O&M, right through to decommissioning. You know, we're getting to the end of life of some of these round one wind farms. It's a really good opportunity for us to understand what the kind of requirements, challenges are around decommissioning, and, you know, develop that learning, package that up and export that to where,
Absolutely.
you know.
I came across on the ferry from Larne to Cairnryan, and the MPI resolution is in
Oh,
Larne
yeah.
Harbour, sitting in the middle. But it's fascinating, absolutely fascinating to see it in the harbour, and
Yeah.
sitting on the jackups. And
The scale of it.
it's just amazing, absolutely amazing. And Claire, in terms of the oil and gas sector, they have that offshore technology.
Mm-hmm.
That, you know, the skills, experience, and those businesses, a lot of them are looking to transition. How are they actually doing that?
So I think there's various things. I think there's like some really easy kind of areas where there's that sort of reasonable transition. I think some companies, certainly companies that we are engaging with, are kind of, they know that they maybe have a solution or a product or a service or a technology that's applicable in offshore wind, but trying to understand where they might fit within the supply chain, who they speak to, what's the market opportunity, domestic market opportunity and global. And so we are engaging with companies like that at various different levels. I mentioned that what we do through OWGPs, we do sort of call it business transformation, and it's providing kind of tailored or bespoke business support, partnering companies up with expert consultancies and helping them with whatever challenges they have, whether it's transitioning into the market, you know, giving them sort of market intelligence. And I think there's sort of, we're engaging with a lot of oil and gas companies at different levels and providing that kind of market information so that they know, okay, well, this is where they would fit, this is who they need to speak to. Quite often we speak to companies that think they need to go straight to the developer, that they would supply into the developer, the operator, but actually they fit within the turbine supply chain. So it's sort of guiding them and giving them the right kind of, maybe helping them to introduce them to the right people and that kind of thing. But we're working with companies like that I'd never come across before, a lot of subsea engineering companies, really cool companies doing mooring connections and things like that for floating. So it's a mix, business support, sometimes it's a bit of funding to develop and innovate and bring the next generation of that product into offshore wind and qualify it, certify it for offshore wind application. So there's a whole host of different things there, and we're learning as we go, really, with these
And
companies.
you also mentioned turbine manufacturers, and I know we've seen Dan announce, some of the turbine manufacturers announcing, you know, manufacturing facilities in the UK. That investment must be, you know, it's fantastic to see. How, you know, do you see that as a growing area?
Well, I've got a lot of personal baggage with this. The reality, I think, of turbine tier one manufacturing is that the market will consolidate as time goes by in terms of, you know, the main players, and I think that's good for the market because we want those domestic champions to be strong, to have full factories, to be investing in their downstream supply chains or upstream supply chains rather. So I think, you know, I think the trend has been positive. Obviously, GE have announced their blade factory. I think the Siemens Gamesa have announced that they will extend their facility in Hull, and you know, and there are others as well. We know Vestas have got their facility on the Isle of Wight. So there's important presence from the manufacturers. For me, what happens next is really developing their supply chains and their innovation. Siemens, for example, do have an innovation centre that's not massively well known about at Keele University, and have, you know, employ R&D engineers in the UK, and they'll want to do more of that in the future, I'm sure. And I think that you know, consolidating that know-how in the UK and then making, you know, building the supply chain that sits behind that is key.
Is there an importance of the consolidation of the supply chain as well? In terms of, you know, keeping costs down and keeping products coming through?
Scale is important in this, particularly offshore. You know, scale is really important. These projects are very long gestation periods. They are incredibly complicated to get over the line. Obviously, there's a very competitive environment in terms of the auctions that you know, enable them to go ahead. So, you know, you want some strength in scale. I don't think it's all about scale. I think we were talking about the SMEs and the role of the SMEs within the sector, and I think that actually a lot of great innovation sort of pushes up the tree, as it were. So it's about getting the balance right. But I think clearly you want some strong tier 1 presence and tier 2 presence that then, you know, that helps provide reliability. And this is so key, you know, in terms of what's made that happen has been the visibility of the pipeline, which has been an important aspect in the role from government, and then an interventionist approach from the government together with the industry doing, you know, things like the Offshore Wind Manufacturing Investment Scheme and OWGP from an industry side. That we're kind of coming at the two things from different approaches, really supporting, let's say, up and coming new innovative companies and transitioning companies from OWGP, but at the same time working on the tier 1, tier 2 major investments from with government intervention. So.
And do you see any challenges sort of over the next 12, 18 months coming through that? Is there enough from policy, you know, the policy side? Are all the business conditions there to you know, see the growth? I see Corinne shaking her head as well. So,
look, the industry so far has been typified by, you know, I don't want to say feast famine because that's a little bit too extreme, but it's you know, 2 years between auctions being, you know, not necessarily guaranteed to happen on the same date every year, you know, so there's kind of quite a lot of theatre and discussion about get you up to the point of an auction going ahead, and that pipeline is so fundamentally important. And what we absolutely don't want to have is these big factories coming to the UK, lots of fanfare, lots of support for them, and then them being so busy that they can't fulfill all the orders, and then they have to import half the technology, and then they're not full enough that they have to send the people to all the factories to keep them. And so the next step of policy development in the UK has to be all about speed to match scale, and that comes down to predictability, a programme that enables factories, investors, innovators to be able to see forward what's coming, plan, and then structure and dimension accordingly. And I think that that's really, for me, the fundamental point of what comes next.
Yeah, I think you addressed the point really well there, Dan. And the reason sort of I was shaking my head there was because actually at one of the UK events, when talking about floating wind, one of the, you know, ABP was saying they need 5 years to get their ports ready to be able to deal with the infrastructure of a floating wind project. And they don't have that 5 years, they have like 3 years. So it's that chicken and egg scenario, and exactly what Dan said, you know, it needs to be that balance of visibility and scalability at the same time that go hand in hand to be able to deliver that.
And what you touch on there is a really important point, because it's a classic example of a market failure in government, in the way the government thinks. You know that there is a market coming. We know that the floating wind is going to be roughly 50% of the 100 gigawatts that we need by 2050 to deliver net zero. So we know the fundamentals of the equation are there, but who is in a position right now to sign a 15-year agreement or a 20-year agreement with ABP for them to spend tens of millions on a port, that certainty isn't there. And unless you can break that market failure, that's where government comes in with its interventionist approach. And it's working on manufacturing. There's 2 big port investments this year. But if you look at floating, it's so fundamental to have the port infrastructure to get the supply chain. And the prize is huge, because if we can do that, we can build the indigenous manufacturing and then really export know-how and engineering capability around the world with this.
Claire, I presume you agree, and in terms of, do you have a view? You know, I think we've talked about that investment, but certainly when we're talking about onshore as well, and Dave, I'd be interested to get your views. It feels like policy certainty, and I refer to it as that whole system thinking. You know, you've got to line everything up to really deliver the ambition. I think the industry has the ambition, but, you know, policy certainty is key, and certainly for the onshore, I think we need, you know, around lining up grid policy, knowing what's happening with auctions. Have you a view, Dave, on that?
Well, just having targets in place allows, as Dan was saying, that the supply chain to establish in order to meet those targets. I mean, we've seen that in France. We've got a couple of construction projects at the moment that form part of a wider cluster. The fact that that cluster's there and there's been this certainty on these projects, another independent service provider has set up a base around there. They have these long-term projects. It enabled those projects to go ahead. So, yeah, if we had shorter-term targets for renewables in the UK, that would point us in the right direction, give the right signals, so the supply chain can gear up to continue to support the industry.
And again, I think, you know, some of that comes through in the onshore wind prospectus as well.
I think we're big advocates of setting targets. It helps focus the mind, not just of, you know, from an industry point of view, we know how to dimension, but also civil servants, you know, government, NGOs, other organisations, at least they know there's something that they're working towards.
Absolutely. And, you know, we've talked a lot, Claire, about the supply chain and scaling it up. Is there anything else that, you know, from your perspective in terms of making it more competitive you can see coming through?
I think it's, I think I might have said this, but I think in terms of making it more competitive, I think what I'm really keen to do is try and understand the areas where we're not really competitive at the moment, and then again with an OWGP perspective, with that understanding, what can we do then to change and address that gap and help companies be more competitive? So whether it's sort of on cost or quality or delivery, or you know making sure that they've got equipment in place to be more efficient and be able to respond to contract, you know, be able to have the kind of machinery or equipment and the skill set in place to be able to deliver when the contracts start coming in with a new pipeline of projects, you know, making sure that they're there, they can be part of that sort of the contracting. So I think there's a balance of like understanding where the gaps are, what are the barriers to being competitive, and then making sure that we are agile and flexible enough to develop programs that target that and you know, help companies to achieve what they need to do. And again, I think it's that combination of giving out funding for new equipment or you know, to develop new products, and it's providing that business support and helping them understand what they need to do to grow.
And Corinne, you know, in sort of your business development, do you see where the sort of barriers are, or where we're not cost competitive yet? You can see where we need to get to?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, actually. I think there's sort of, depending on which angle you look at this, if you're coming from a developer's perspective or a supply chain perspective, there's a number of different answers to that question, really. I think sort of just going back before I answer the question to Claire's point, you know, in order to create competition, we need to be, you know, the key to creating good competition is being collaborative on that framework together. So we do need to have that competition in the industry to drive the goodness sake, for goodness me, sorry, innovation within the sector, and obviously keep driving forward this sector. Going back to your question, I couldn't really pick out one particular area, if I'm honest. I don't know if anyone else on the panel could, but I think, like I say, it depends on what area you look at this from, whether it's from a on the grounds networking BD perspective or from an innovative supportive funding perspective or a developer's perspective. There's quite a few sort of answers to that question.
I think one of the key things that we see is cost, really, is helping companies need to be more cost competitive, and quite often we're kind of engaging with companies that are sort of putting in proposals for funding, and they're saying that quite often a lot of that work is going overseas to overseas competitors because they can do it cheaper, and developers, and it's so cost driven. So I think it's hard. There's not like one right answer, but really helping companies to drive their costs down, be more cost competitive, and it's sort of related to risk. The industry is very risk averse, so it's I think in order to drive costs down, you need to innovate. Sometimes the industry is not as open to innovation if it's going to be risky. So there's a sort of perfect storm there of things that need to be addressed, I think, to help companies be more competitive.
But back to Dan's point, there's a perfect opportunity to create that supply chain that actually can then be, into the future exported globally, I think.
I mean, I don't necessarily think that British companies are hampered necessarily by costs. I mean, let's not forget that Denmark and Germany, probably have higher average wages than we do, and things like that. It's about productivity, which is a lot for long term has been British manufacturers, sort of Achilles heel, and I think therefore, working to drive productivity is important, and this goes right the way to the core of the Treasury strategy and industrial strategy in general, and ultimately value will emerge through a combination of productivity and technology, and if that's where something like OWGP is so important to to find where can we deliver value to a developer based on technology, and I think if I look as well at some of the other areas, and the question was where we're not competitive, if I look at offshore, for example, we haven't successfully really scaled up delivering offshore substations, for example. Still a lot of fabrication gets done in yards outside of the UK. Tried to do some of it in the UK. It's not always been successful. There's more we can do to scale that up. We've now got some tower manufacturing announced in the UK, but we did have a tower manufacturer before. That wasn't enough productivity, but there wasn't enough volume. So I think the equation is so clear, and it's that combination of predictability in the volume, the active industrial strategy by government, and industry backing it with things like OWGP, and then we can start to scale up.
And maybe just a final word, Dave, from the onshore perspective, we need to scale up too from an onshore perspective.
Yeah, exactly. Drake as an owner wants to acquire more projects in Scotland or in the UK, so they're going to need this service chain to support these things. And it's really encouraging to hear about the innovation on the offshore and these fields and where that's going, because Drake also has stakes in offshore projects. We have to make assumptions about these OPEX costs into the future, and we are assuming that the innovation does happen in order to be competitive when you bid, so it's very encouraging. We expect it to happen, so look forward to it.
Thanks, everybody. Time has flown past. It's been a fascinating discussion. So really, just for everybody watching, I want to thank our panel. It's clear we've a lot of work to do to maximise our supply chain, but huge opportunities exist. So thank you very much for participating today.
Thank you. Thank you.